Have you ever left a normal day feeling completely exhausted, even though nothing big actually happened? What if being overwhelmed for no reason actually has a reason, and your brain is just processing more than people realize? If you've ever felt this way, you're not imagining it, and you're not alone. Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Minds That Think Differently. I am your host, Amanda. For accessibility, I'll give a short visual description of myself. I'm 16 years old, I have brown shoulder-length hair, and today I am wearing a blue t-shirt with flowers. Today I will be talking about sensory stimuli and overstimulation and why it matters. I just want to note that I'm not a medical professional and I do make mistakes, so if I do, please let me know. If you have stories, questions, or would like to be on the podcast, please email connect@thinkdifferentpod.com. And with that, let's get started. Have you ever walked into a place and instantly felt like everything was too much? The lights feel too bright, the sounds feel too loud, people are talking over each other, and you can't focus on any one thing. And no matter how hard you try to ignore it, it just keeps building. And eventually, it's not just uncomfortable, it's overwhelming. If that sounds familiar, you're not alone, and you're not overreacting. Today, we're going to talk about why that happens. But before we get into everything, I want to quickly ground this for anyone who might be new here. When I talk about sensory processing, I'm talking about how your brain takes in and responds to the world around you. Things like sound, light, touch, movement, and even what's happening inside your body. For some people, their brain filters that information easily, but for others, it can feel like too much, not enough, or just different. And that's what we're going to explore today. So if any of this feels unfamiliar, don't worry. I'm going to break down everything step by step. Before we get into everything else, I just want to talk about why this actually matters. Sensory processing isn't just a concept. It affects how you experience the world every single day. It can impact school, relationships, focus, emotions, and even your sense of safety. And a lot of the time, people misunderstand it. They might see someone as overreacting or too sensitive, when in reality, their brain is just processing more or less sensory input than expected. Understanding this helps us better understand ourselves and others. First, I will discuss what sensory stimuli and sensory processing is. The brain receives a massive amount of sensory information every second, but only consciously responds to a tiny portion of that information. So let's start with the basics, because once you understand the different senses, everything else in this episode will make a lot more sense. There are 8 senses. Now this might surprise you because you can easily name 5. Taste, smell, touch, sight, hearing. But what about the other 3? Have you ever heard of proprioception, vestibular, or interoception? Let's break each one down with real-life examples so you can start to recognize them in your own life. You can experience each sense in different ways. Some people are hypersensitive, which means they experience too much input and things feel louder, brighter, stronger, or more intense. Other people are hyposensitive, which means they don't get enough input, so they might seek out more stimulation to feel regulated. If that isn't making sense to you, another way to think about it is sensory seeking and sensory avoidant. If your brain isn't getting enough input, you might seek it out, and if your brain is getting too much, you might try to avoid it. Someone who is sensory seeking may crave movement, pressure, or strong input, and someone who is sensory avoidant may avoid certain environments, textures, or sounds, and many people are both depending on the sense. Touch receptors are all over your skin and are responsible for experiencing pressure, texture, temperature, vibration, and pain. If you are hyposensitive to touch, you might not notice when someone taps you on the shoulder, and you might seek out deep pressure like tight hugs and weighted blankets. If you are hypersensitive to touch, you might avoid physical contact like hugs or handshakes, feel overwhelmed by light touch by someone passing by you, or be bothered by clothing tags, seams, or certain fabrics. Next, the hearing or auditory system. Auditory receptors in the inner ear process volume, pitch, tone, rhythm, and distance of sounds. If you are hyposensitive to sound, you might not notice when someone calls your name, struggle to follow verbal instructions, and seek loud music or background noise. If you are hypersensitive to sound, you may struggle in crowded or noisy environments, be distracted by background noise others tune out, or be easily overwhelmed by loud or sudden noises, something like a cafeteria, school hallway, or even multiple people talking at once can feel overwhelming or even painful. Sight, or visual. Your eyes process color, brightness, contrast, movement, and spatial awareness. If you are hyposensitive to visual input, you might seek out bright lights, colorful objects, or visual stimulation. You might enjoy watching spinning objects, patterns, or moving lights. If you are hypersensitive to visual input, you might be sensitive to bright lights or sunlight, prefer dim lighting or minimal visual clutter, and get headaches or eye strain easily. Taste or the gustatory system. Your sense of taste detects flavors like sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and spicy. If you are hyposensitive to taste, you might prefer very strong or spicy flavors, seek intense taste experiences, and add extra seasoning to food. If you are hypersensitive to taste, you might have a limited range of foods you enjoy, be hesitant or anxious about trying new foods, or strongly dislike certain textures or tastes. Smell, or the olfactory system, detects odors in the environment and is closely connected to memory and emotion. If you are hyposensitive to smell, you might not notice strong or unpleasant odors, seek out strong scents like perfume or candles, and be less bothered by environmental smells. If you are hypersensitive to smell, you might have strong emotional reactions to scents, feel nauseous, or get headaches from certain odors, avoid places based on how they smell, or be overwhelmed by strong scents like perfume, cleaning products, or food smells. And if this feels like a lot of information, that's okay. You don't need to remember all this. The goal isn't to memorize it, it's just to start recognizing patterns in your own life. Now, the vestibular system is the sixth sense. It is located in the inner ear and helps with balance, movement, and spatial orientation. If you are hyposensitive to vestibular input, you might seek movement like spinning, swinging, or jumping, enjoy fast rides or activities, constantly fidget or move your body. If you are hypersensitive to vestibular input, you might get dizzy or carsick easily, feel unsteady or anxious with movement, or struggle with balance or coordination. Now, the seventh sense, proprioception, or body awareness, tells you where your body is in space and how your muscles and joints are moving. If you are hyposensitive to proprioception, you might stand too close to others without realizing it, bump into things or people, or use too much or too little force when doing tasks. For example, you might slam doors without meaning to, or press too hard when writing. If you are hypersensitive to proprioception, you might prefer having personal space, feel uncomfortable in crowded spaces, avoid physical contact, and be very aware of your body position. Finally, the eighth sense is interoception, which is your internal body awareness. It helps you understand what's happening inside your body, like hunger, thirst, pain, temperature, and emotions. If you are hyposensitive to interoception, you might not notice when you're hungry or thirsty, miss signs that you need to use the bathroom, have difficulty identifying emotions, or not recognize pain or temperature changes. If you are hypersensitive to interoception, you might have difficulty ignoring physical discomfort, be highly aware of body sensations, and feel hunger, pain, or discomfort very strongly. For example, a small stomach ache or emotional shift might feel very intense and hard to ignore. And that's all 8 senses. But remember, I told you about hyper and hyposensitive. You might not relate to either of them if you don't have sensory processing issues. Then you may just fall within a more typical sensory range. For me personally, I am hypersensitive to touch, gustatory, auditory, and hyposensitive to visual, olfactory, vestibular, interoception, and proprioception. I'm hyposensitive to most of them, So I'm more of a sensory-seeking person, but I'm also sensory avoidant in other ways. Take a moment to think about which senses you are hyposensitive to and which you are hypersensitive to. Sensory processing is not one size fits all, and we all process differently. You may be sensory avoidant, sensory seeking, or a mixture of both like me. Most people will be a mixture of both. Something else that's really important to understand is that your senses don't work in isolation. They interact with each other. So it's not just one sense at a time. A lot of the time, it's multiple senses being triggered at once. For example, in a cafeteria, you're hearing conversations, which is your auditory system. You're seeing a lot of movement and bright lights, that's the visual system. You smell food, that's the olfactory system. You're sitting in a chair that might feel uncomfortable, tactile. All of that combines into one experience. For someone without sensory sensitivities, their brain filters most of that out automatically. But for someone with sensory processing differences, their brain might take in all of that at the same intensity, which can become overwhelming very quickly. This is why overstimulation isn't just one thing. It's a combination of everything happening at once. I also want to talk about internal and external stimuli. Internal stimuli would be things like thirst, hunger, or need for sleep, and external stimuli originate from the environment and include things like light, sound, temperature, touch, taste, and smell. The first 5 senses are external stimuli, and the last 3 are internal stimuli. So once you understand the senses, the next step is understanding how they show up for you personally. And that's where sensory profiles come in. Sensory profiles are a way of mapping out your sensory needs and preferences. It considers each sense one by one and helps you identify your responsiveness to sensory input and determine your just right sensory experience. It can be done with a professional such as an occupational therapist, or you can do it yourself. Why is it important to know your sensory preferences? Because it can give you improved self-awareness, increase your daily functioning and emotional regulation, and it can help improve your mood and relationships. I talked about the just right sensory level. This is basically the amount of sensory input your brain needs to feel focused, calm, and regulated. If you don't get enough input, you might feel bored, restless, and understimulated. And if you get too much input, you might feel overwhelmed, anxious, or overstimulated. Everyone has a different just right level, and it can even change depending on the day, your mood, or how tired you are. Now I want to talk about the highly sensitive person in SPD. Let's start with the highly sensitive person. Highly sensitive people are a term coined by the psychologist Elaine Aron. These people have increased emotional sensitivity, stronger reactions to internal and external stimuli, and a complex inner life. Living with high sensitivity can come with challenges, but also good things. They may struggle to adapt to new circumstances and easily become uncomfortable with light, sound, or physical sensations, but also can form deep bonds with others, have exciting dreams and inner monologues, and find great joy in art, music, and human connection. I also want to briefly talk about sensory processing disorder, or SPD, which is something I talked about in the last episode. This is when the brain has more difficulty processing sensory input. Some people may be over-responsive, meaning things feel overwhelming. Others may be under-responsive, meaning they don't notice sensory input as much, and some people seek out sensory input very strongly. It's important to know that sensory processing exists on a spectrum, and you don't need a diagnosis to relate to these experiences. Before we continue, let's take a short sensory break together. Remember that this is something I will do in every episode. If you're able to, pause what you're doing for just a moment. If you're in a safe place, you can close your eyes. If not, just soften your focus or look down. Take a slow, deep breath in through your nose and gently breathe out through your mouth. Now begin to notice your body, not trying to change anything, just noticing. Notice where you are sitting or standing. Notice the feeling of the surface beneath you, the pressure, the support, the weight of your body. If it feels okay, press your feet gently into the ground. Feel that connection. You are here. You are supported. Now bring your attention to your shoulders. If they feel tense, allow them to drop just a little. No force, just letting them soften. Bring your awareness to your hands. Maybe gently press your fingers together, or rub your hands lightly just to feel that sensation. Now listen. What is one sound you can hear right now? It might be my voice, a fan, a distant sound, or even silence. Just notice it. You don't have to react to it. Now notice your breathing again. If your mind starts to wander, that's okay. Just gently bring it back to your breath or to the feeling of your body. Now I want you to imagine a place where you feel calm or safe. This could be a real place or an imaginary one. Maybe it's a quiet room, a beach, a forest, or somewhere completely your own. Stay there for just a moment. Now slowly bring your attention back to your breath, back to your body, back to where you are now. And when you're ready, gently refocus. So now that we understand the senses and how differently they can be experienced, let's talk about when it becomes too much. This is called overstimulation. Overstimulation can look different for everyone, but some common experiences include feeling overwhelmed or irritable, difficulty concentrating, wanting to escape or leave the situation, feeling anxious, panicked, or shut down, or like everything is just too much all at once. Even just a few weeks ago, I had a really overwhelming day at school. I had a lot of tests, and the hallway just felt really crowded, and I kept bumping into people by accident. Then the fire alarm went off in the middle of one of my classes, and that was really overstimulating. And then by the time I was in my last class of the day, gym, I was already having a shutdown, and the lights in the gym were really bright, and there were too many sounds and people, and I was completely overstimulated. Overstimulation can be caused by things like loud environments, bright or flashing lights, crowded spaces, strong smells, too many conversations or tasks happening all at once. Sometimes it's not just one thing, it's the combination of everything. For example, imagine being in a crowded store. There's music playing, people talking, carts moving, bright lights, and announcements overhead. For some people, that's just normal. But for someone with sensory sensitivities, all of that input can build up very quickly and become overwhelming. And if you relate to this, you're not overreacting. Your brain is doing its best to process more input than it can comfortably handle. Overstimulation doesn't usually start all at once. It starts small. Maybe a sound feels a little too loud, a light feels a little too bright, someone brushes past you and it feels a little more intense than it should. And then it builds. More sounds, more movement, more input. Your brain is trying to process all of it at the same time and it can't filter it out. And suddenly, it's just too much. You might feel overwhelmed, irritated, or anxious, like you need to escape, but you can't explain why. And if you've ever felt that way, remember that you're not overreacting. When overstimulation becomes too much, it can lead to meltdowns or shutdowns. Meltdowns are outward responses like crying, yelling, or losing control, and a shutdown is inward like going quiet, zoning out, or withdrawing. Both are responses to overwhelming environments. Some signs of overstimulation might include covering your ears or avoiding certain sensations, zoning out or shutting down, getting overwhelmed quickly, feeling the need to leave, or having strong emotional reactions. Sensory overload and anxiety can feel very similar, but they aren't the same thing. Sensory overload is caused by too much input from the environment, and anxiety is related to thoughts, fears, or anticipation. However, they often overlap. Sensory overload can trigger anxiety, and anxiety can make sensory experiences feel more intense. So now that we understand what overstimulation is and why it happens, let's talk about what you can actually do about it. So, how can you manage overstimulation? The first step is recognizing your own sensory needs and patterns. The more you understand what overwhelms you and what helps you feel regulated, the easier it becomes to respond before things reach a breaking point. And something really important to understand is that coping with overstimulation isn't just about what you do in the moment. It actually starts before you even get overwhelmed. One of the most helpful things you can do is plan ahead for overwhelming environments. A sensory kit can be a very helpful tool to help cope with these environments. A sensory kit is basically a small collection of items that help you regulate when you start to feel overwhelmed. This can include headphones, fidget toys, a comfort item, or a calming scent. The goal is to have the tools ready before you need them so you don't have to figure it out in the moment. Another important skill is learning your early warning signs. A lot of the time, overstimulation builds, and your body usually gives you signals before you reach that overwhelmed point. Some early signs might include feeling on edge, difficulty focusing, wanting to be alone, feeling tense or restless, or increased sensitivity to sound, lights, or touch. If you can recognize those early signs, you can step in before it turns to full overstimulation. Like someone bumping into me, I find that I usually just want to get away and get out of wherever I am. I want to escape the situation. If you're already feeling overstimulated, the goal is to reduce the amount of sensory input and help your nervous system calm down. Some strategies might include reducing sensory input by moving to a quieter or less crowded space, stepping away from the noise, closing your eyes or looking away from visual input, using sensory tools, weighted items or deep pressure fidget toys, headphones or noise canceling earbuds, also grounding techniques such as focusing on your breath, naming things you can hear, feel, see, or holding something cold or textured to bring your focus back to the moment. Movement, especially if you are sensory seeking, such as rocking, pacing, stretching, or walking around. For me personally, I find that the most helpful things are moving to a quieter environment and using items like fidget toys. The issue is that it's not always possible to get away from the environment. Another really important coping strategy is having an exit plan. If you know that you're going into an environment that could be overwhelming, it helps to know where you can go if you need a break, how you can leave if it becomes too much, and who you can communicate with. For example, this might mean stepping outside for a few minutes, going to the bathroom for a break, or letting a friend know that you might need to leave. Knowing you can leave often makes situations feel more manageable, even if you don't end up needing to. Something that doesn't get talked about enough is what happens after overstimulation. Even once you leave the situation, your body might still feel exhausted, overwhelmed, and emotionally drained. Recovery is just as important as prevention. This might look like spending time in a low stimulation environment, listening to calming music, resting, taking a nap, or engaging in a special interest. It's important to remember that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Something that helps one person might not help someone else. Some people need less stimulation, some people need more stimulation, and some people need a mix of both depending on the situation, and that's completely okay. The goal isn't to fix yourself, it's to understand yourself. If you relate to any of this, it doesn't mean that something is wrong with you. It just means that your brain processes the world differently, and that difference is valid. Once you understand that, you can start building a life that works with your brain instead of against it. I want to talk more about advocating for your sensory needs because this is something that sounds simple, but in reality, it can be really difficult. Advocating for yourself means recognizing what you need and allowing yourself to ask for it, even if it feels uncomfortable. And for a lot of people, especially if you've spent years masking or trying to fit in, that can feel really scary. Advocating can look like a lot of different things. It might look like asking to step out of a loud room for a few minutes. It might look like wearing headphones, using fidget toys, or choosing clothing that feels comfortable instead of what's expected. And something really important to understand is that advocating doesn't have to be big or obvious. It can be small choices that you make for yourself every day, like sitting in a quieter area, lowering the lights, or giving yourself permission to take breaks. Asking for the use of fidget toys is something I personally did at the start of middle school, and I was so scared that I only brought fidget toys that were small, made no noise, and I could fidget with them without people seeing. Then I moved up to stress balls and larger fidgets, and I began to stim more in class. I think it's something that benefited me, but the fear of people judging you is a lot to manage. I also want to acknowledge that not everyone feels safe advocating in every environment. There can be fear of judgment, fear of standing out, or even fear of not being taken seriously. And those fears are real. The fear of being judged, of standing out, that can be just as overwhelming as the sensory input itself. But your needs don't become less valid just because they're not understood by others. For example, when I started high school, I stopped bringing fidgets to school. I would have one in my backpack as a last resort and never use it. I think a subconscious part of me was still worried about people judging me. Even still, I only use my fidget toys if I'm overstimulated, having a panic attack, or shut down. I still feel this sort of pressure to be able to go through school without anything. This is a really good example of internalized ableism. I want to share my story because I understand that it can be very hard to ask for accommodations or use visible accommodations that will show other people you are different. This is something I still struggle with, and I am still growing and learning. Advocating is a skill, and just like any skill, it takes time to develop. You don't have to be perfect at it. You don't have to explain everything perfectly. You just have to start recognizing that your comfort and your well-being matters. I also want to make something really clear. Sensory needs are not preferences. It's not that I prefer quiet or I just don't like that texture. For many people, it's physically uncomfortable or overwhelming to the point where they can't function. That's a really important distinction because it changes how we understand the behavior. Sensory needs are also not a weakness. They are not something you need to push through or ignore. They are signals from your brain and body telling you what you need. When you listen to those signals instead of fighting them, that's when things start to feel more manageable. And the more people who start advocating for their needs, the more we move towards environments that are more inclusive and understanding for everyone. Not just for neurodivergent people or those with sensory sensitivities, but everyone. I also want to talk about how sensory processing shows up in daily life, because this affects real situations every day in ways people often don't realize. In school, sensory issues can impact focus, learning, and behavior. A student may struggle to concentrate in a noisy classroom, feel overwhelmed by bright lights, or have difficulty sitting still due to sensory needs. These challenges are often misunderstood. What might look like distraction or lack of effort might actually be someone trying to stay regulated in an environment that feels overwhelming, or even behavioral issues is often a sensory need that isn't being met. For example, a student might seem like they're not paying attention, but they could easily be overwhelmed by background noise or visual distractions. For me personally, the cafeteria is a big place that can be very overwhelming. Some days it's manageable, like I don't even hear the noise. And other times when it's been a really long day, all I can focus on are all these conversations happening around me, and everyone is so loud and it can get very overwhelming. And that's something important to understand, is that sensory experiences can change based on the day. Something might feel fine one day and completely overwhelming the next, depending on things like stress or how much input you've had. Sensory processing also shows up in a lot of social situations. For example, someone might avoid parties, crowded events, or busy environments, not because they don't want to socialize, but because those environments are overwhelming. There might be loud music, lots of conversation happening all at once, bright lights, and constant movement. From the outside, it might just look like someone is being antisocial or uninterested, but in reality, they might just be trying to manage sensory overload. It can also affect communication. If someone is overwhelmed, they might have a harder time processing what people are saying, responding quickly, or staying engaged in conversation. Sensory differences can also show up at home, which a lot of people don't think about. Things like the texture of clothing, the feeling of certain fabrics, and the sound of appliances, or even the lighting of a room, can all impact how comfortable someone feels in their own space. Sensory processing can also show up in public spaces like stores, restaurants, or transportation. Imagine walking into a store where there's bright lighting, music playing, people talking, carts moving, and strong smells all at once. For some people, that's just a normal experience. But for someone with sensory sensitivities, that combination can become overwhelming very quickly. And that's something to understand is that these reactions aren't intentional. People aren't choosing to feel overwhelmed or to react this way. It's their nervous system responding to too much input. Sensory processing can also affect relationships. Someone might need more personal space, avoid physical contact, or prefer quieter activities. Without understanding, sensory processing might be misinterpreted as being distant, uninterested, or rude. But in reality, it's about comfort and regulation, not a lack of care. Another thing that people don't talk about enough is masking sensory needs. Masking your sensory needs could look like forcing yourself to wear uncomfortable clothes, not covering your ears even when something is too loud, or ignoring the need to take a break. Over time, masking sensory needs can make overstimulation worse because you're not allowing yourself to regulate or take breaks when you need them. And a lot of people don't even realize they're doing it. They think, I just have to deal with it, or this is normal. So when we talk about sensory processing, we're not talking about isolated experiences. We're talking about something that can affect school, relationships, daily routines, and how someone moves through the world overall. And when you start to recognize these patterns, it becomes easier to understand yourself and start making changes that actually support your needs. I also want to take some time to talk about misconceptions, because there are a lot of misunderstandings when it comes to sensory processing. One of the most common ones is the idea that people are just being dramatic or overreacting. But what's important to understand is that sensory experiences are not equal for everyone. What feels like mild background noise to one person might feel overwhelming or even painful to someone else. It's not about exaggeration. It's about differences in how the brain processes input. Just because something doesn't feel intense to you doesn't mean it isn't intense for someone else. Another misconception is they'll get used to it. And while sometimes people can adapt, constantly forcing yourself to tolerate overwhelming environments can actually lead to burnout, increased anxiety, and more intense sensory responses over time. There's also the idea that sensory issues are just preferences, like I don't like loud places, or I'm just picky. But for many people, it's not a preference. It's a physical and neurological response. It can impact focus, emotions, and the ability to function in the moment. Another big misconception is that sensory issues only affect young children. In reality, they affect people of all ages. The difference is, as people get older, they often learn to mask or hide their reactions, so it becomes less visible, but that doesn't mean it goes away. And something else that's really important is not everyone who experiences sensory sensitivities has a diagnosis, and not everyone needs a diagnosis to have valid experiences. A lot of people go through life feeling overwhelmed, avoiding certain environments, or struggling with things like noise, light, or texture, without even realizing that sensory processing might be a part of it. They just think, I hate crowds, or I'm just picky, or I get overwhelmed easily, without realizing there's an actual reason behind it. And finally, one of the most harmful misconceptions is the idea that people should just push through it. Pushing through might work in the short term, but over time it can make things worse. It can lead to burnout, shutdowns, and a disconnect from your own needs. Understanding sensory processing isn't about labeling people. It's about creating more awareness, more empathy, and more supportive environments. Because when we understand that people experience the world differently, we can start to respond with support instead of judgment. And if this is your first time learning about any of this, I just want you to take one thing away. Your experiences are valid, and there are ways to understand and support your brain. If you've ever felt overwhelmed and didn't know why, if you've ever been told you were too sensitive, or if you've ever felt like the world was a little too much, now you have a reason. Now you have the language for it. And most importantly, there is nothing wrong with you. Your brain just works differently, and that difference matters. Now I will do a short recap of everything I discussed in this episode. First, I talked about what sensory processing is and the 8 different senses, as well as being hypo and hypersensitive, and sensory seeking and sensory avoidant, and we learned that all ways of processing sensory information are valid. Then I talked about sensory profiles and finding the right level of sensory input for you. Then I transitioned into the highly sensitive person, an SPD, and then we had a sensory break to ground ourselves and break up all the information in this episode. After the sensory break, we talked about overstimulation, what it looks like, what the signs are, and what it can lead to. Then we talked about managing overstimulation and coping strategies and how there is no one-size-fits-all solution because everyone reacts differently to sensory overload. Then I talked about advocating for your needs and how advocating can be difficult, and then I talked about how this can show up throughout life, and finally I ended with some misconceptions about sensory processing. Then I will end with an affirmation. The affirmation for this episode is, my sensory needs are valid and I am allowed to take care of myself. The question for this episode is, what environments or situations make you feel most overwhelmed and what helps you feel more regulated? You can think about this on your own or email me your response. I may feature it in a future episode. In the next episode, I will be discussing masking and camouflaging, so stay tuned for that. If you enjoyed this episode, please let me know and follow on your favorite platform and share with someone who might be interested or benefit from it. Thank you for listening to Minds That Think Differently, and I'll see you next time.